Hi everyone, my name is Susan Smythe-Kung and today I'm talking about language documentation and Creative Commons licenses. In 1992, Michael Krauss penned his now famous call to action to the field of linguistics that you see here. Many linguists answered Krauss's call to action and a new subfield, language documentation, emerged. The 1990s also brought the advent of digital recording technology as well as broader access to the internet, both of which allowed for quick and easy digital sharing, which in turn gave rise to the open access movement. The Creative Commons licenses were released in 2002, and they contribute to the OA movement by facilitating legal sharing of digital creations. Within 10 years of Krauss's call to action, several digital language archives were established with goals both to preserve recordings of understudied and underdocumented languages and to provide online access to those recordings. Many more such archives have been established since, and many traditional brick-and-mortar archives have digitized and made available their physical language collections. Within another 10 years, granting programs specifically for documenting endangered languages were established, and many funders began to require that the results of sponsored language documentation be released as open access publications, and that the data be archived in publicly accessible online digital repositories. The synchrony of all these events has resulted in a plethora of discrete, born digital files that are the results of language documentation. Many of these files are or will be archived in digital repositories, where for the most part they are publicly accessible in the sense of Seyf Edinepur et al. 2019 for consultation, sharing, and reuse for educational purposes. In my abstract, I use the term language documentation data to describe these files, but I've since come to realize that this assemblage of digital content represents more than just the results of language documentation and includes the material results of what Leonard 2017 calls language work, his umbrella expression to include language documentation, description, teaching, advocacy, and resource development. In this talk, I use the term materials when reference to language work alone is not sufficient. While some of the material content of language work is not protected by copyright law, a great deal is, and specific types of language work materials might be protected automatically in some countries, but not protected at all in others. Furthermore, since copyright endures 50 to 100 years beyond the death of the creator, depending on the jurisdiction, archives users wishing to create derivatives or reproductions of archived works must seek permission from the creators or their heirs. The difficulty in finding and contacting creators or their heirs, or the heirs of their heirs, results in proliferation of archived orphaned works locked in copyright for long periods of time. One solution is for creators of digital language materials to apply an open license, such as the Creative Commons licenses, to their creations. CC licenses allow creators to easily license their digital creations so that it's immediately apparent how the creation may be reused. However, it's important to critically examine what it means to apply a Creative Commons license to digital creations that result from language work. While I do believe that the application of CC licenses can help ameliorate negative impacts that archived orphan works have on language research, revitalization, and reclamation, I caution that application of Creative Commons licenses to language work must be carefully considered with due diligence paid to indigenous data sovereignty protocols. I am not a lawyer. I cannot give legal advice. This presentation does not contain legal advice, and this presentation should not be interpreted as legal advice. So now that the disclaimer is out of the way, I want to explore these questions. What are some of the complexities of copyright with respect to language work and especially to traditional knowledge? When is it appropriate to apply a Creative Commons license to language work, and when should they be avoided? What factors should be considered when choosing a Creative Commons license, and how can CC licenses support the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance? Copyright is a set of several rights, including the right to distribute or share a work and the right to create derivative works or adaptations. Copyright automatically applies to a creative work at the moment it's created, and these rights belong exclusively to the creator for the duration of their life and to their heirs for an additional 50 to 100 years after their death, depending on the jurisdiction. Thereafter, the work passes into the public domain, where it may be reused or adapted by anyone and for any purpose. Determining copyright for many materials resulting from language work can be challenging. Western legal systems hinge on concepts of creativity, originality, authorship, and limited monopoly. Facts about the world and common knowledge are not protected by copyright and are thus considered to be in the public domain. A great deal of content that results from language work falls into this category. These content types include, but are not limited to, words in a language, traditional stories that are common knowledge within the community, and procedures for doing tasks such as planting and harvesting food or building a house. The copyright status of language work materials is further complicated by this issue. Even if the content of a recording, such as a traditional story, falls into the public domain, a particular recorded example of that content might be creative enough to be protected by copyright. If we add an element of creativity and authorship to the items on these bullets, then these products probably will be protected by copyright. Furthermore, what's considered creative enough to be protected by copyright can vary greatly between jurisdictions, so there's no simple test that can be applied in all cases. The situation becomes more complex when we consider traditional knowledge. Many of the things that copyright law considers to be common knowledge or facts about the world are considered to be traditional knowledge or TK by indigenous peoples. The World Intellectual Property Organization, or WIPO, defines TK as knowledge, know-how, skills, and practices that are developed, sustained, and passed on from generation to generation within a community, often forming part of its cultural or spiritual identity. Under this definition, traditional cultural expressions, a subcategory of TK, include folklore, music, dance, art, design, ceremonies, and narratives. Clearly, a lot of the content of language work falls under this definition of traditional cultural expressions. The 2007 United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples clearly established indigenous sovereignty over their histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literature, and their intellectual property in all of its forms. The point at hand here is that the intellectual property that's protected in the UN Declaration is exactly the kind of intellectual property that Western copyright law considers to be in the public domain. WIPO suggests using copyright and trademarks as ways to protect contemporary adaptations of traditional cultural expressions, and many indigenous peoples in the United States and Canada are doing this, and some are turning to Creative Commons licenses to facilitate the open sharing of their language work. The primary problem when applying Creative Commons licenses to some kinds of language work materials lies in the fact that the Creative Commons licenses work in conjunction with copyright, and there is a tension between Western copyright law and the nature of indigenous intellectual property. These tensions revolve around questions of authorship, who is the author of traditional knowledge, originality, if everyone in the community knows a story, where's the originality? Duration, copyright is meant to end eventually, but traditional knowledge is meant to endure for generations. And fixation in the tangible medium requires fixation of something that has traditionally been intangible or oral. Another area of tension happens at the intersection of the open movement, to which the Creative Commons belongs, and the indigenous data sovereignty movement. Here, there's a conflict between the ease of access for which the open movement advocates and the possibility that ease of access could, and often does, result in appropriation and exploitation of indigenous intellectual property. Further, using a Creative Commons license on something indicates that that thing is intended for broad distribution and use. These licenses are not intended for things that need to remain confidential or that should have limited distribution. Any decisions to apply Creative Commons licenses to language work that includes traditional knowledge needs to be undertaken by the relevant indigenous community that owns the knowledge. However, it's important to remember that 1, not all language work materials include traditional knowledge, and 2, the types of traditional knowledge that need to be protected differ between communities. For the subsets of materials that allow for sharing and qualify for copyright protection, Creative Commons licenses can be an equitable alternative to copyright alone. All 6 licenses include the attribution or buy element, which allows for the free and open sharing of digital media, provided that the creators are appropriately attributed or cited. Thus, the question of authorship must be addressed prior to the application of a license. Con 2018A suggests that when applying a Creative Commons license to a work, a legally recognized community could be attributed as the author, just as a university or corporation might be. Even though this type of corporate authorship will shorten the duration of copyright, It will help to enforce the community's ownership of the intellectual property, and it can be seen as an act of reclamation, in that the indigenous community establishes itself as the creator of a digital work and thereby claims the copyright to that creation and further controls how the creation can be used by others. The ND element stands for no derivatives, and it specifies that no adaptations of a work bearing a license with this icon may be shared or distributed in any way. In practice, the two CC licenses that include this element have been used to protect works that deal with traditional knowledge, when it's especially important to ensure that a community's words or expressions are not modified, altered, or taken out of context. The SA element stands for share alike. These two licenses are the Creative Commons version of copyleft licenses, because when the share alike element is included, all adaptations of the work must be shared using the exact same license. The share-alike element allows for community-specific reuse, including adaptation and remixing to create new language teaching materials that would in turn have to be licensed under the same share-alike license. Since commercial use is allowed under CC by SA, communities can even allow their members or collaborators to create derivative products that might be merchandise or apps to help fund their language programs. The CC by NCSA license can help prevent outside commercial exploitation. The NC element indicates that no commercial use of the licensed work is allowed. When the community is recognized as the author and a non-commercial license is applied, the community retains commercial control of that intellectual property, and they're still free to use it commercially if they choose. The CARE principles for Indigenous data governance grew out of the need to ensure that Indigenous peoples retain sovereignty over their data, even when it's outside of their immediate control, and that their traditions and knowledge are taken into consideration in the processes of handling, storing, preserving, sharing, and reusing the data. The CARE principles are intended to be used in conjunction with the FAIR guiding principles for data management and stewardship, as evidenced by the hashtag #BeFairAndCare. It should go without saying that the CARE principles should be followed throughout the entire life cycle of language work. Here I offer some ideas on how the application of Creative Commons licenses to digital language materials may be aligned with the CARE principles. The C in CARE stands for collective benefit. Creative Commons licenses can allow for Indigenous peoples to collectively benefit from the content of a work in ways that the all rights reserved model of copyright does not allow. When a CC license is applied to a work, anyone, including Indigenous peoples, can share the work freely and reuse or adapt it according to the terms of the license. A stands for authority to control. All CC licenses require attribution for the authors. When Creative Commons licenses are applied to language works and those works are attributed to Indigenous peoples, either individuals or collectives, then Indigenous peoples maintain control over the work, which in turn facilitates language reclamation efforts. R stands for responsibility. Everyone engaged in language work wants the resulting materials to be used responsibly for the good of the language community. Creative Commons licenses facilitate responsible reuse because they clearly indicate the type of reuse that's allowed. Use of any of the Creative Commons licenses will ensure that the Indigenous peoples are appropriately attributed, provided that they're listed as the authors of the work. Licenses with the NC element help to ameliorate commercial misuse, and licenses with the ND element help prevent misappropriation of the language, traditional knowledge, and cultural heritage. Finally, licenses with the SA element ensure that any resulting adaptations must be shared under the same license, further mitigating the chances for misuse and misappropriation. E stands for ethics. As the CARE principles state, Indigenous peoples' rights and well-being should be a primary concern. The same holds true in the application of Creative Commons licenses to language materials. Simply taking the time to engage in conversations about attributions and licensing helps to promote the ethical treatment of Indigenous peoples and their languages. I hope I've successfully demonstrated that while Creative Commons licenses might not be appropriate for all types of language work materials, there are benefits to applying them to certain materials on a case-by-case basis, and that Creative Commons licenses can help support Indigenous data sovereignty. In closing, I cannot stress enough how important it is that language workers and researchers, regardless of their indigeneity, collaborate with the relevant Indigenous communities to arrive at satisfactory arrangements for the ownership, and licensing of their language work. That satisfactory arrangement might or might not include the application of Creative Commons licenses to some or all of the materials. This QR code leads to my list of references, as well as a few examples of language work licensed with Creative Commons licenses. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions that you might have. Oh, and if you have more examples for me to add to this list, please send them my way. Thank you.